Good morning. Welcome to day 2 of the Hannah Arendt Center conference, Truth-Telling, Democracy in an Age Without Facts. We have heat today, so I'm sure some of you are happy. Now the challenge is to stay awake, but you won't have any problem with the lineup of speakers we have for you today. It's really an all-star lineup, and I'm very excited to get it going this morning. Once again, my name is Roger Berkowitz, the director of the Hannah Arendt Center. We're going, just a quick note on we're starting about 10 minutes late. We'll go about 10 minutes after. We have 3 speakers in a row this morning, and they're sitting off stage because you're going to get to see some video during our first speaker, and they'll all get to enjoy it. But we'll go right from the first to the second to the third talks, and then take a nice long lunch break after that. In addition, during lunch, there will be a panel of the 5 winners of the Hannah Arendt Thinking Challenge competition, talking about their submissions, and I hope you'll all be able to come back and catch all or some of that. Our next speaker is a very special guest. He's, in addition to being an old friend and now colleague at Bard, he's someone that we will all do well to read and hear. Here is something he wrote, hasn't been published, but wrote about an encounter he had a couple of years ago, which I think sets the tone for our conference and some of his remarks. He wrote, "I attended a public conversation at Harvard between novelist Jonathan Franzen and critic James Wood. It was called Jonathan Franzen Reviews the Corrections with James Wood. And this was provocative because Wood, one of our most influential literary critics, had taken issue upon its appearance in 2001 with Franzen's best-selling and widely hailed novel. At last, I thought, a serious public conversation between a novelist and a critic about a work of art, about the gulf between what an artist sets down and what a critic finds there. The large Harvard hall where the men met was packed to standing room. For an hour, the two spoke politely, generously, evasively. Despite the advertised title, not once was Wood's review mentioned. When the Q&A began, I raised my hand. Given, I said, that we were living in highly contentious times, the 2008 presidential election loomed. Rival parties were unable to do better than insult each other when matters warranting real debate went unaddressed. Wasn't it a missed opportunity for writers of their sophistication not to engage directly their points of contention? Why, I asked, had they evaded the matter? Why, in short, had they forfeited their right to civil discourse by failing to engage in an exchange of ideas on the matters that mattered to them most? Later at dinner, our next speaker reports that Mr. Franzen said to him, "That was a wicked question." Why was such a question wicked? I assume because it asked 2 intelligent people to confront honestly their disagreements. What the question sought was not a debate of point-counterpoint, as we too often get on TV and presidential debates, but a thoughtful engagement with important ideas. What it sought was criticism. Criticism, from the Greek krinein, to cut, to distinguish, is often a lost art today. The Oxford English Dictionary first defines criticism as fault-finding, as making negative judgments. Only in the second definition do we simply get that it is a way of making judgments of literary or artistic work. Well, our next speaker is one of the premier literary critics and artistic critics of our time. He excels at asking wicked questions that are nevertheless never wicked. His criticism has exposed plagiarism and explored the paradox of monstrous writers who nevertheless fashion prose of excruciating power and beauty. Unlike many of his fellow critics, he consistently reviews new and lesser-known writers he loves and to whom he wishes to bring an audience. And for his efforts, our next speaker, whose name is Wyatt Mason, has won a National Magazine Award for Reviews and Criticism and the Nona Balakian Citation for Excellence in Reviewing from the National Book Critics Circle Awards. He is also a very well-published and awarded translator, having published translations of the complete Rimbaud, Rimbaud Complete from the Modern Library, I Promise to be God, the complete letters of Rimbaud, and also A Season in Hell and Illuminations of Rimbaud, as well as other translations that he's done. He is currently a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine and at Harper's Magazine, and is, to my great pleasure, a colleague here at Bard, where he is a senior fellow at the Hannah Arendt Center for Politics and Humanities. So please welcome Wyatt Mason.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Roger, for that astonishingly gracious introduction, never to be equaled in all my subsequent years, I'm sure. So here we are. On this morning before the first winter storm of the season, it's said to be about to drop a foot of snow on this region, which industriously is arriving 2 months before winter. With that looming whiteout approaching from the west, let's begin the second day of Truth-Telling in an Age Without Facts. Yesterday, President Botstein, bringing these proceedings to their start, told us about Bard's connection to the late writer and thinker Hannah Arendt, his former teacher, in whose name the center that is hosting these days of comment and conversation has been founded. She believed in the public space, President Botstein said, in the public space and in the public world. But he went on to say, lately we have seen the culture having endured, quote, the collapse of language, a complete lack of rhetoric, a complete lack of means by which we might see ourselves keep up a conversation about what is to be done, unquote. Without the means to conversation, the common world crumbles, was his point. The common world is therefore made up of words, words exchanged, understood, and answered. Let today, or at least the subtext of today, be about what is to be done. Not that it was any less the subtext of yesterday. My friend Professor Berkowitz, founder and director of the Arendt Center, concluded his characteristically thoughtful remarks with these lines. Today we have a debate about what a liberal arts education is to be. On one side, some insist it is to be insulated from the world, an ivory tower of arcane knowledge. On the other side, college should teach engagement with the world, and students should be active in politics and social causes. What is needed, however, is neither and both, Berkowitz continued. In the spirit of Arendt, we must reaffirm a liberal arts tradition that is engaged with the world, and yet, from afar. We must teach and learn to think what we are doing, but to do so as conscious pariahs, separated from the world. So, if Roger is right, in practical terms, what might that look like? For Zadie Smith, for those of you who weren't here yesterday, it meant sitting down and brooking the feelings of pointlessness that attend the attempt at writing sentences, sentences that become, during composition, their own end. One makes them as best one can, and that making, that attempt at bestness, is its own end, but briefly. Smith suggested that the end of such a hope might be that we could, using such sentences, leverage them against the void, turning empty space into a public space once again, through books that could still reach us. Smith said, "How will books sound in the future? Perhaps like a voice you hear whispering in a public bathroom through a hole in the next stall. Writing that builds itself up from small foundations, that feels homemade and idiosyncratic, less of an epic boast and more of a kind of query. I have this feeling. Do you? I saw this thing. Can I make you see it? I had this thought. Can you understand it? I am in this relation to death. Are you? I am in this relation to technology. Are you? I am in this relation to myself and in this relation to the world. Are you? I am wondering whether I exist at all. Are you? I am wondering whether writing is possible. Are you? Which is maybe only to say that prose will, in ways both spiritual and vocational, approach the condition of poetry, she said, and by which she meant approach a condition of cultural obsolescence. Naomi Oreskes spoke of what she called the vast machine of contemporary scientific community, and the tiny but powerful wrench in the gears of that vast machine, the financial political community cynically bent on opportunistic doubt-mongering for a financial and only a financial end. During the question and answer period, she spoke to the notion that many scientists, like the Arendtian pariah mentioned by Roger, prefer to work in seclusion. Whose job is it to make the connection, she asked. The job of taking the news to the people should be undertaken by journalists, was the thought. We see how well that's worked out, she said. Again, to the practical matter of transmission. How might the truth be told? Is the truth to be relegated to the status of a poem, no longer read but rumored to be beautiful? Or is there a way its sound might reach the ears of those who would hear it? A number of citizens that I have to believe, and I think everyone in this room wants to believe, and indeed believes, is large, is most of us. What might the person who makes the connection look like is a reasonable question. We are practical people living in difficult times. Must this sort of truth teller stand outside the culture, a pariah, outside the public space, at the edge of the clearing, at the middle of the culture? Or must they make the leap into the clearing? What might a truth teller look like? What might technology look like if I could use it? Subtitles serve us doubly today, for those of us who don't speak Chinese. None of those sound matters. It's all in Chinese. Okay. On Monday, the 12th of May, 2008, a magnitude 8 earthquake hit Szechuan province in central China. Current estimates put the death toll at nearly 90,000. But at the time, owing to the chaos, numbers were hard to come by. One thing quickly became clear, though. Throughout the province, from town to town, school buildings, most of which date to recent decades, seemed unusually prone to collapse. Buildings around the schools often remained standing, while time and again the schools, 7,000 schoolrooms, were reduced to rubble and dust. School had been in session when the collapses occurred. Among the dead, it was gruesomely clear there would be thousands of small children. The state news agency, Xinhua, reported the event and its cleanup, and indeed, thousands of photos of the dead circulated. Children lying in body bags being clutched by parents disfigured by grief. brightly colored backpacks pulled from the rubble and pressed impossibly flat, looking more than anything like pools of spilled paint, red, yellow, blue. A wail rose up from the parents of the children, an outcry that the government of the People's Republic, the PRC, heard. In the wake of the disaster and the rising upset, the PRC said it would absolutely investigate. And yet months passed with not another word from it on the subject. Of course, these were not ordinary months in China. It was, you'll recall, the spring before the August opening of the 2008 Beijing Summer Olympics. In preparation for the event, in the weeks and days before the opening ceremonies of the Olympics, ceremonies that, you'll recall, originally Steven Spielberg had signed on to produce, until in February he withdrew vocally from his commitment, citing China's unwillingness to act against the government of Darfur, another story. But in preparation for the opening of the Games, factories around Beijing were being closed to reduce emissions. Most of China's power comes from coal factories, 70%. Bans were in place against the burning of coal fires by individuals in the city, and silver iodide was shot into the skies over the capital for months in the hopes of improving the quality of the air. It's called cloud seeding. Air that routinely reached emergency conditions, that is to say, a routine day in Beijing is an emergency condition. To live there is to live in a state of emergency that goes unacknowledged, emergency the norm. The AQI, which is the EPA standard for air quality, which is based on 5 carcinogens that can be found in the air, runs from 0 to 500. Anything over 300 is considered a state of emergency. At least 30 days a year in Beijing are state of emergency. You're not supposed to go outside. 22 million people go outside. And most days, the other 300, it's in the 200s, which is to say, exceedingly dangerous. $17 billion were spent in the months prior to the opening of the 2008 Olympics just on the reduction of smog in preparation for the 2 weeks of global focus on China. At the Olympic opening ceremony, after a blue-skied day, a 9-year-old survivor of the Szechuan earthquake, Lin Hao, who saved several classmates, whose school collapsed around him, he took a child out in his arms, went back in, took another child out. He carried a flag next to the famous Chinese basketball star Yao Ming and paraded through the Bird's Nest Stadium. Exquisite public relations opportunities aside, by the end of the year, the government hadn't produced a list of names or a death toll of the children who had been killed in their schools in Szechuan. Much less had they produced a comprehensive report of what had caused this massive failure of the schools themselves. They acknowledged in a report in December that indeed the schools did suffer an inordinate series of collapses, that indeed building codes were not up to snuff, and that this would be looked into. But as to naming the children, as to counting the children, as to allowing the parents in a one-child country to file death certificates so they would be allowed to have another child, this had not been done. So, citizens grew outraged. Some began to investigate on their own, including the man we see on screen, who some of you will know as Ai Weiwei. I'll say more about him. But for now, know that in December of 2008, using his blog, a blog that attracted millions of comments since he began it in 2005, a blog that the Chinese government had in fact given to him and another few celebrities in 2005 as part of their attempt to spread goodwill. He called for volunteers to canvass the province, to speak to parents, to assemble a list of the names of the children. This he felt was the least that was owed them, the dignity of being named. In March, another activist investigating the earthquake, Tan Zuoren, whom I mentions above, published a report that claimed he had uncovered evidence that municipal officials throughout the region had pocketed money that should have gone to the building of the schools and substituted inferior building materials, which came to be characterized as tofu construction, throughout the area. He was detained, Tan Suoren, in March, as soon as his report was issued. I don't read Chinese. The report hasn't been properly translated, or officially translated, but what of it I've read through translation suggests that it is a series of questions that he's asking, not a series of accusations. Unfazed by Tan Suoren's detainment, Ai Weiwei, by March, had collated a list of 5,212 names collected by his volunteers, which, in addition to scores of articles about the investigation, he published in full on the blog, a blog which government censors had begun monitoring, deleting the occasional post. Nonetheless, I continued to speak out. He covered one large wall of an office of his Chaoyang studio in Beijing with 80 sheets of paper, printed with the names of the children, an Excel spreadsheet. It was a backdrop he used for interviews to the international press. And as you'll see, it was a sort of rough draft of an installation that he was beginning to conceive about the deaths. I was not only an activist, but actually he was an artist who'd become an activist, more about which soon. For now, appreciate that the People's Republic might already have been annoyed with Ai. Given the government hadn't pursued a public investigation of the deaths that they had promised, hadn't allowed the state-controlled media, Xinhua, after reporting the events themselves, after showing the pictures of the dead, hadn't allowed further report. Ai's activities, though they hadn't reached most Chinese citizens, had reached a meaningful fraction in the millions, not to say and significantly, they'd been broadcast around the world freely through the international press. What follows over the next 6 months, and essentially to this day, amounts to an escalatory series of tactical strikes between Ai and the People's Republic. For goaded by Ai's having gone public, embarrassing them internationally at home, the PRC finally released a list of the dead a month after Ai's had been released, as if trying to put the final period on that document. 2 days later, actually 20 days later, they shut down Ai's blog for good. They deleted 10 million posts, they deleted every page, and it is now gone from the internet. To make sure that their message to Ai had been clearly received, at the beginning of June of 2009, they stationed 2 security cameras, like those oriented on Tiananmen Square, on a pole opposite his front door. Denied his blog, aware that he was under surveillance, Ai began tweeting, a practice that at its peak has gotten him 100,000 followers to over 60,000 tweets. Some days during the summer of 2009, he tweeted over 100 times. Because each character in Chinese is a word, you can say a lot more in the same tweet. Even so, you should know, if you don't, and many of us don't, as I'll show, as with Facebook and Google, the 500 million internet users in China are banned from accessing Twitter because of the charmingly nicknamed Great Firewall, which has been set up by the People's Republic. To access Twitter from within China, as I did and others do, I being AI, not I should say, I being the family name in China comes first, Ai Weiwei. You have to set up what's called a VPN, a virtual private network. It allows users to log into the internet without being surveilled. How this works is essentially you go online through the People's Republic normal internet, and then you go to a link, which is a link that takes you to a server in a different country. Using that server in a different country, you log into the internet, and therefore you are now invisible to the searching eyes of the PRC. Those login site links change weekly, and so you're constantly staying a step ahead of the people who would like to stay a step ahead of you. I didn't know any of this, and it turns out I was in pretty good company as far as ignorance goes on the technological front, because apparently it's CEO-level ignorance. It wasn't until March of 2010 that Twitter's founder, Jack Dorsey, came to learn that his company's service was banned in China. Amazingly, he found out from Ai Weiwei during a panel discussion in New York about new media. I then asked him pointedly when Twitter would have a dedicated Chinese language main page, because Chinese users of Twitter were logging in through an English language front page. Twitter has many different language front pages, but they didn't have one in Chinese at the time. And Dorsey said, "It's just a matter of time." I laughed. It wasn't a golly, that's funny laugh. He said, "This is very philosophical. Everything is a matter of time." I don't like to hear that. 18 months later, last month, on the 15th of September, Twitter finally managed to launch a Chinese language main page. So, I began tweeting. Still focused on the earthquake. In August of that year, he traveled to Chengdu to try to testify in the case of Tan Zuoren, who'd been detained in March, who was the other earthquake activist, who'd said that substandard building materials had been substituted. I and his group traveled to Chengdu, and then at 3 a.m., the night before the trial, where he hoped to testify, where he was on a witness list, the police broke into I's hotel room.